The summer of 1994 in Mobile, Alabama was the kind that made children dream of endless days and parents pray for September. Heat waves danced off the pavement like ghosts, and the humidity hung thick enough to swim through. But on that particular Saturday afternoon in July, none of the families gathering at Riverside Park for the annual St. Matthew's Episcopal Church picnic were thinking about the weather. They were thinking about potato salad, three-legged races, and the blessed relief of cold lemonade under the ancient oak trees that lined the Mobile River. Eli Sanderson was 7 years old that day, with sandy brown hair that refused to stay combed and freckles scattered across his nose like constellation points. His mother, Margaret Sanderson, had dressed him in his best khaki shorts and a crisp white polo shirt, the kind of outfit that would photograph well for the church newsletter. She had no way of knowing that those clothes would become evidence, that the description of what her son was wearing would be repeated so many times by so many people that the words would lose all meaning, becoming just sounds in the air, syllables that meant nothing and everything at once. The picnic started like every church gathering in Mobile that decade. Pastor William Carter stood at a makeshift podium constructed from folding tables, his deep voice carrying across the crowd as he blessed the food and the fellowship. His wife Bernice stood beside him, her floral dress perfectly pressed, her smile the practiced warmth of a pastor's wife who had learned to love her congregation even when they tested her patience. She watched the children run between the tables, their laughter mixing with the sound of the river lapping against the bank, and felt that familiar contentment that came with community, with belonging, with the simple pleasure of watching families come together in the name of something larger than themselves. But even in that moment of peace, something felt different. The adults sensed it first, the way animals sense a coming storm. Conversations were a little too loud, laughter a little too forced. Parents kept checking and rechecking where their children were, calling out names more frequently than usual. There had been stories in the news lately, whispered conversations about dangers that good Christian families weren't supposed to worry about, fears that crept into bedtime prayers and made mothers hold their children a little tighter. Eli spent the first hour of the picnic exactly where he was supposed to be. He won second place in the sack race, cheered enthusiastically during the adult softball game, and managed to eat 2 helpings of Mrs. Patterson's famous mac and cheese without spilling a drop on his white shirt. His parents relaxed. Margaret Sanderson even found herself chatting with other mothers about school supplies and fall soccer leagues, the kind of normal conversation that felt like a luxury when you spent most of your time worrying about whether your child was safe, happy, developing properly. The lemonade stand was Margaret's idea. She had volunteered to run it, positioning herself at a folding table under a blue and white striped tent near the playground equipment. From there she could keep an eye on Eli while he played with the other children, and she could see most of the picnic grounds. It seemed like the perfect solution, the kind of practical mothering that other women in the congregation admired. She filled cup after cup with the tart, sweet liquid, accepting quarters and smiles with equal grace, feeling proud of her contribution to the church community. It was just after 3 o'clock when Eli appeared at her table, his face flushed from running around in the heat. He asked for lemonade in that slightly breathless way children have when they've been playing hard, and Margaret poured him a full cup, watching as he drank it down in 3 quick gulps. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, grinned at her, and said he was going back to play with Tommy Patterson and the Hendricks twins near the river. Margaret nodded, distracted by a line of customers that had formed at her table, and told him to stay where she could see him. But the thing about children is that they move like water, flowing from one place to another without anyone really noticing the transition. One moment Eli was visible through the crowd, his white shirt a bright spot among the other children, and the next moment he was simply gone. Not dramatically gone, not with screams or obvious danger, but gone in the way that children disappear at busy gatherings, slipping between the gaps in adult attention like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. Margaret didn't realize he was missing until Mrs. Patterson approached her table 20 minutes later, asking if she had seen Tommy. The 2 women stood there for a moment, scanning the crowd, expecting to spot their sons at any second. Children were always wandering off at these events, getting distracted by something more interesting than whatever they were supposed to be doing. But as the minutes ticked by and neither boy appeared, that familiar parental anxiety began to creep up their spines, cold and insistent. The search started casually. the way these things always do. A few parents asking around, checking the obvious places. The playground equipment yielded nothing but a forgotten sweater and someone's lost shoe. The softball field was empty except for a few teenagers throwing a frisbee. The parking lot produced nothing more alarming than teenagers sneaking cigarettes behind pickup trucks. For the first 30 minutes, everyone maintained the fiction that this was just a minor inconvenience, the kind of thing that would resolve itself with embarrassed laughter and stern talks about staying close to parents. But Tommy Patterson turned up 45 minutes later, found behind the church van playing with a handheld video game he'd borrowed from an older cousin. He looked confused when the adults descended on him with questions about Eli, genuinely puzzled about why everyone seemed so concerned. He said Eli had been with him by the river, but then he'd gotten distracted by the game and hadn't noticed when his friend wandered off. Children, he seemed to suggest with the innocent logic of a 7-year-old, were always wandering off. It wasn't his job to keep track of where they went. Pastor Carter took charge of organizing the search efforts, his voice carrying the same authority it held from the pulpit on Sunday mornings. He divided the remaining picnic-goers into groups, assigning each a section of the park to cover systematically. The mothers stayed close to the picnic area, calling Eli's name in voices that grew increasingly strained. The fathers spread out toward the river, moving through the tall grass and brush with the methodical determination of men who understood that hoping for the best meant preparing for the worst. Margaret Sanderson stood at the center of it all, her face a mask of controlled terror that every parent recognized but prayed they would never wear themselves. She answered the same questions over and over again. What was he wearing? When did you last see him? Was he upset about anything? Had he mentioned wanting to go anywhere specific? Her responses became automatic, robotic, as if saying the words enough times might somehow bring her son back through sheer repetition. The mobile police department arrived just as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Officer James Rodriguez was the first responder, a young cop who had only been on the force for 2 years but who carried himself with the careful professionalism of someone who understood that every call might be the one that changed everything. He set up a command post near the parking lot and began taking statements, his notebook filling with details that would later be typed into reports and filed in cabinets and eventually forgotten by everyone except the people who lived with the consequences. The river search began at sunset, when the golden light made the water look deceptively peaceful, almost gentle. Local volunteers with boats and flashlights combed the banks and shallows, looking for any sign of a small boy who might have fallen in, gotten swept away by currents that looked calm from the surface, but could pull a child under in seconds. The divers arrived the next morning, professionals from the county rescue squad who moved through the murky water with the grim efficiency of people who had done this before, who knew that time was not their friend. For 3 days, the story dominated local news coverage. Eli's school photo appeared on television screens across southern Alabama, his gap-toothed smile frozen in time, his eyes bright with the kind of innocence that made adults want to believe the world was still a safe place for children. The reward fund grew to $15,000, raised through church donations and community bake sales, and the desperate generosity of people who needed to believe that money could solve problems, that enough caring could bring missing children home. But rivers keep their secrets, and Mobile Bay is vast and unpredictable, its currents capable of carrying objects far from where they first entered the water. After a week of searching, with no evidence found and no credible leads to follow, the official investigation began to wind down. The Coast Guard suspended their active search. The dive teams moved on to other emergencies. The news crews packed up their equipment and left to cover stories that might actually have conclusions. The case was never officially closed, but it was quietly filed away under the assumption that Eli Sanderson had somehow fallen into the Mobile River and drowned, his small body carried out to sea by currents that erased all traces of what had happened to him. It was a tragedy, the kind that left families shattered and communities scarred, but it wasn't a mystery. Children fell into water all the time. Children drowned. It was horrible and senseless, but it wasn't complicated. Margaret Sanderson never accepted that explanation. She spent years following up on false leads, driving hundreds of miles to investigate reported sightings, joining support groups for families of missing children, where she learned to speak the language of hope and grief in equal measure. Her marriage didn't survive the loss. Her husband David remarried 3 years later and moved to Georgia, unable to stay in a place where every familiar location reminded him of what they had lost. Margaret remained in Mobile, trapped by the possibility that Eli might someday come home and need to find her there, waiting. The church community rallied around her for a while, bringing casseroles and offering prayers, and including her in activities with the determined kindness of people who believed that enough love could heal any wound. But grief has its own timeline, one that doesn't conform to social expectations, and eventually their patience wore thin. Margaret's ongoing sorrow became uncomfortable, a reminder of possibilities they preferred not to consider. Invitations grew less frequent, phone calls stopped coming. The conspiracy of silence that settles over communities after tragedies began to form, the quiet agreement that some subjects were better left undiscussed. Pastor Carter delivered the memorial service 6 months after Eli's disappearance, in the same sanctuary where the boy had been baptized as an infant. His sermon focused on faith in the face of incomprehensible loss, on the promise that all things work together for good for those who love God, even when human understanding fails to grasp the purpose behind suffering. The congregation wept appropriately and sang hymns about eternal rest and heavenly reunions, but underneath the ritual comfort lay the unspoken fear that if this could happen to the Sandersons, it could happen to any of them. Bernice Carter sat in the front pew that day, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in the expression of sympathetic sorrow that she had perfected over years of ministering to grieving families. She reached out to Margaret Sanderson afterward, offering the kind of pastoral care that pastors' wives were expected to provide. But the two women never became close friends. There was something about the case that made Bernice uncomfortable, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly what it was. A feeling that lingered at the edges of her consciousness, a sense that important details were being overlooked or deliberately ignored. The years passed and life in Mobile moved forward with the relentless momentum that carries communities through tragedies. Children grew up and graduated, families moved away, and new ones took their places. The story of Eli Sanderson became local legend, the kind of cautionary tale that parents used to warn their children about staying close and being careful near water. But memories fade, and pain becomes bearable. And eventually, most people stopped thinking about the little boy who had vanished on a July afternoon when the heat made everything shimmer like a mirage. Pastor Carter continued his ministry at St. Matthew's for 18 more years after Eli's disappearance, building a reputation as a compassionate leader who helped families through their darkest moments. He performed hundreds of baptisms and weddings and funerals, counseled countless couples through marital problems, and delivered sermons that consistently drew standing-room-only crowds on Easter and Christmas. His leadership helped the church grow from a small parish to a major presence in the Mobile religious community, with a new sanctuary and expanded outreach programs that served families throughout the region. Bernice supported her husband's work with the dedication that was expected of pastors' wives in those days, organizing potluck dinners and vacation Bible school programs and women's retreat weekends. She taught Sunday school to generations of children, helped coordinate mission trips to Central America, and maintained the kind of open-door policy that made the parsonage a safe haven for anyone in the congregation who needed counsel or comfort. They were, by all accounts, a model clergy family, the kind of people who made their denomination proud and their community stronger. But Bernice never forgot the strange feeling she'd had during Eli Sanderson's memorial service, the nagging sense that something important was being left unsaid. She found herself thinking about Margaret Sanderson more often than she expected, wondering how the woman was managing her grief, whether she had found any peace in the years since her son's disappearance. There were moments when Bernice considered reaching out, making a phone call or writing a letter, but she always hesitated, unsure of what she could possibly say that would make any difference. William Carter died on a Tuesday morning in November of 2012, 18 years and 4 months after Eli Sanderson disappeared. It was sudden and peaceful, a massive heart attack that took him while he was drinking his morning coffee and reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Bernice found him there when she came downstairs, still in his pajamas, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his face relaxed in an expression of such calm that she almost didn't realize anything was wrong. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners from across Alabama and beyond, testimony to the impact that William Carter had made during his long ministry. The current bishop delivered the eulogy, praising William's dedication to his congregation and his community, his wisdom in counseling families through crisis, his ability to provide comfort and hope even in the darkest circumstances. Bernice sat in the front row, accepting condolences with the grace that had been trained into her over decades of public ministry. But inside, she felt strangely hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of her chest and left her fundamentally altered. The months that followed were filled with the practical details of widowhood, insurance claims and legal documents, and decisions about what to keep and what to donate, and what to simply throw away. The church provided meals and emotional support, and offers to help with whatever she needed, but Bernice found herself craving solitude, time to process not just her grief, but the strange sense of relief that accompanied it. She had loved her husband, had been grateful for their life together, but she was surprised to discover how much of herself she had sacrificed over the years to be the person he needed her to be. It was in March of 2013, when the spring cleaning bug finally bit her, that Bernice decided to tackle the attic of the parsonage. The church board had given her until the end of the year to decide whether she wanted to stay in Mobile or move closer to her sister in Birmingham, and cleaning out decades of accumulated possessions seemed like a necessary first step, regardless of what she ultimately chose to do. She climbed the narrow stairs to the attic one Saturday morning, armed with garbage bags and storage boxes, and the determination to be ruthless about what deserved to be kept. The attic was a museum of their marriage, filled with Christmas decorations and old sermon notes and boxes of photographs that chronicled church events and family vacations and milestone moments. Bernice worked methodically through the accumulated debris of a life well lived, sorting items into piles for donation, storage, and disposal. Most of what she found triggered pleasant memories, or at least neutral nostalgia, the kind of gentle melancholy that comes with reviewing a largely successful life. But it was in the far corner of the attic, behind a stack of boxes containing William's seminary textbooks, that she found the wooden crate that would change everything. It was small and plain, the kind of box that might have once held wine or crafting supplies, sealed with several layers of packing tape that had yellowed with age. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing that should have made her heart start beating faster as she picked it up and felt its unexpected weight. Something inside shifted when she moved the crate, something that didn't feel like books or papers or any of the other items she had been finding. Bernice carried it downstairs to the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she searched for a knife to cut through the tape. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that it was probably just old church supplies or personal items that William had stored and forgotten about. But as she worked to open the crate, that old feeling from Eli Sanderson's memorial service came flooding back, the sense that important truths were hiding just beneath the surface of things that seemed perfectly normal. The first thing she saw when she lifted the lid was plastic wrap, the clear kind used for food storage, wrapped carefully around something small and rectangular. Her hands moved without conscious direction, unwrapping the package to reveal a child's prayer card, the kind given out at Sunday school, decorated with cartoon angels and a simple Bible verse about God's love for little children. The card was in perfect condition, as if it had been sealed away immediately after being handled, preserved like evidence in a criminal investigation. But it was what lay beneath the prayer card that made Bernice's breath catch in her throat. A small wooden crucifix, hand-carved and painted with the kind of meticulous care that children put into art projects meant for their parents, the kind of gift that any pastor would treasure, the kind of thing that would normally be displayed on an office shelf or bedroom dresser, not hidden away in a sealed crate in an attic, where no one would ever think to look. Bernice stared at the objects for a long time, her mind working to process what she was seeing, to understand why her husband would have hidden away what appeared to be gifts from a child in his congregation. She turned the crucifix over in her hands, looking for any marking or inscription that might identify its creator, and found what she was looking for carved into the base in the careful letters of a child learning to write. The name carved into the wood was Eli Sanderson. The kitchen clock ticked with mechanical precision, but time seemed to have stopped entirely for Bernice Carter, as she sat staring at the wooden crucifix in her trembling hands. The name carved into its base might as well have been written in fire for how it burned itself into her consciousness. Eli Sanderson, the little boy who had vanished 18 years ago, whose disappearance had shaken their entire community, whose memory had been carefully wrapped in the comfortable fiction of accidental drowning and divine mystery. But here was evidence that challenged that narrative, sitting on her kitchen table like an accusation that had been waiting nearly 2 decades to be discovered. The prayer card and crucifix weren't just random items that happened to belong to a missing child. They had been deliberately preserved, wrapped in plastic and hidden away with the kind of care reserved for things that were either precious beyond measure or dangerous beyond comprehension. And Bernice couldn't think of any innocent reason why her husband would have possessed them, much less why he would have concealed them so thoroughly. Her first instinct was denial, the desperate human need to find explanations that preserved the world as she understood it. Perhaps Eli had given these items to William before his disappearance, and her husband had kept them as mementos of a child he had cared about. Perhaps Margaret Sanderson had given them to William after her son vanished, asking him to hold on to them as remembrances of a life cut short. Perhaps there was some perfectly reasonable explanation that would make this discovery heartbreaking, but not sinister, sad, but not suspicious. But even as Bernice tried to construct these alternative narratives, she knew they didn't hold water. If William had received these items legitimately, there would have been no reason to hide them away like contraband. A pastor who possessed mementos of a missing child from his congregation would display them proudly, would speak of them during sermons about loss and hope and the mysterious ways that God worked in human lives. He certainly wouldn't wrap them in plastic and seal them in a wooden crate hidden behind seminary textbooks in an attic where they might never be found. The silence in the house felt oppressive, weighted with implications that Bernice wasn't ready to confront. She had lived in this parsonage for over 30 years, had raised her children here, had hosted countless church dinners and meetings and counseling sessions within these walls. Every room held memories of William's ministry, evidence of the good work he had done, the lives he had touched, the difference he had made in their community. But now the familiar spaces felt different, as if the discovery in the attic had somehow contaminated the entire house with questions she didn't want to ask. She walked through the rooms mechanically, looking at family photographs and church awards, and the accumulated evidence of what had appeared to be an exemplary life of service. William smiling with confirmation classes, William blessing babies at baptisms, William shaking hands with bishops and community leaders, William delivering meals to shut-ins and visiting patients in the hospital and offering comfort to families in crisis. How could the man in these photographs be the same person who had hidden away items that belonged to a missing child? The possibility that began to form in Bernice's mind was so terrible that she couldn't allow herself to think it directly, could only approach it sideways like someone trying to look at the sun without going blind. But the questions were there, insistent and growing stronger with each passing hour. How well had she really known her husband? What had he been doing during those long hours when he claimed to be conducting church business? Why had he sometimes been so evasive about his schedule, so reluctant to discuss certain aspects of his pastoral duties? She remembered the phone calls that came at odd hours, conversations that William would take in his study, with the door closed, speaking in low tones that she couldn't quite make out. She remembered the weekend trips he sometimes took alone, saying he needed time for spiritual reflection or continuing education seminars that she was never invited to attend. She remembered the way he sometimes seemed distant and preoccupied, as if wrestling with burdens that he couldn't or wouldn't share with her. At the time, she had attributed these things to the normal pressures of ministry, the weight of carrying other people's secrets and sorrows, the occupational hazard of being available to a congregation that needed him at all hours of the day and night. Pastors' wives learned to accept that their husbands belonged first to God and second to their communities, that marriage to a clergyman meant sharing him with hundreds of other people who had legitimate claims on his time and attention. It had never occurred to her to question whether those claims were actually legitimate. The phone rang just after sunset, startling Bernice so badly that she dropped the crucifix she had been holding. It clattered across the kitchen floor, coming to rest near the refrigerator, where it seemed to watch her with wooden eyes as she answered the call. It was Patricia Hendricks, one of the church board members, checking to see how she was managing and whether she needed help with anything. Patricia's voice was warm and concerned, full of the genuine affection that the congregation felt for their former pastor's widow. Bernice found herself responding automatically, saying all the right things about how grateful she was for everyone's support and how she was taking things one day at a time. But underneath her polite responses, She was acutely aware of the evidence sitting on her kitchen table, the secret that had suddenly made her complicit in something she didn't understand. Should she tell Patricia what she had found? Should she call the police? Should she try to contact Margaret Sanderson and ask whether she had any memory of giving these items to William? But even as these questions ran through her mind, Bernice knew she wasn't ready to voice them to anyone else. She needed time to think, to process what this discovery might mean, to decide what kind of person she was going to be in response to information that could destroy everything she had believed about her marriage and her husband's character. Speaking the questions aloud would make them real in a way that she wasn't prepared to handle yet. After Patricia hung up, Bernice sat alone in her kitchen as darkness settled over Mobile, staring at objects that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the lamplight. She tried to imagine the circumstances under which William might have come to possess them, but every scenario she constructed led to conclusions that made her feel physically sick. If Eli had given them to William before his disappearance, why hide them? If someone else had given them to William after Eli vanished, why not mention that to the investigators, who had questioned everyone in the church community? The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that these items represented some kind of trophy, some memento that William had kept for reasons that she didn't want to contemplate. The careful preservation, the deliberate concealment, the fact that they had never been mentioned or displayed or acknowledged in any way suggested that they held significance that went far beyond their apparent innocence. And if that was true, then everything she thought she knew about her husband and her marriage and her life was built on foundations that were crumbling beneath her feet. Sleep was impossible that night. Bernice lay in the bed she had shared with William for 32 years, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her. Every creak and whisper seemed amplified, as if the building itself was trying to tell her secrets that she had been too trusting or too naive to notice before. She found herself remembering conversations and incidents that had seemed perfectly normal at the time, but that took on sinister implications in light of what she had discovered. There was the way William had always insisted on handling certain aspects of the children's programs personally, never delegating those responsibilities to other volunteers, even when his schedule was overwhelmed. There was his unusual interest in families that were struggling financially or socially, his tendency to offer private counseling sessions that sometimes stretched late into the evening. There was the locked filing cabinet in his study that he claimed contained confidential pastoral records, documents that he said were too sensitive to be accessible to anyone else, even his wife. She had accepted all of these things without question, because they seemed consistent with William's dedication to his ministry, his commitment to helping people through their most difficult moments. Pastor's work was often confidential, often required discretion and sensitivity that couldn't be shared even with family members. She had been proud of his conscientiousness, his refusal to compromise the trust that people placed in him when they came to him for help. But now she wondered whether that trust had been misplaced, whether the confidentiality he insisted upon had been protecting not his parishioners, but himself. How many other secrets might be hidden in his study, in his files, in corners of their life together that she had never thought to examine? How many other families might have trusted him with their children, never imagining that their pastor might be someone they needed to protect their children from? The next morning brought no clarity, only a deepening sense of unreality that made everything feel slightly off-kilter, as if she were viewing her life through a funhouse mirror that distorted familiar shapes into something unrecognizable. Bernice made coffee and toast with automatic movements, her hands performing routine tasks, while her mind remained fixated on the questions that had kept her awake all night. She kept glancing at the kitchen table, where the crucifix and prayer card remained exactly where she had left them, proof that she hadn't dreamed the whole terrible discovery. She tried to go about her normal routine, sorting through more boxes from the attic, answering sympathy cards that were still arriving months after William's funeral, making phone calls to family members and friends who were concerned about how she was adjusting to widowhood. But every conversation felt like a performance, a carefully constructed facade that concealed the chaos that was building inside her. How could she discuss funeral arrangements and insurance policies and plans for the future when she didn't even know who her husband had really been? It was during her third trip to the attic that morning that Bernice made her second disturbing discovery. She had been working her way through William's study materials, boxing up theology books and sermon notes for donation to the seminary, when she noticed something odd about one of the cardboard file boxes that had been stored near the wooden crate. The box was labeled Parish Records 1990-1995 in William's careful handwriting, but when she lifted it, it felt far too light to contain 5 years' worth of documentation. Inside the box, instead of the membership rolls and baptismal certificates and financial records she expected to find, there was only a handful of manila folders and what appeared to be a small tape recorder, the kind that had been common in the 1990s for dictating notes and letters. The folders contained photocopied newspaper clippings about missing children cases from across Alabama and neighboring states, articles that had been carefully cut out and organized by date and location. Some of the clippings were about Eli Sanderson, but others documented disappearances that had occurred years before and after his vanishing. The tape recorder was old, but appeared to be in working condition, with a cassette tape still loaded inside it. Bernice stared at it for a long time, her hands shaking as she tried to decide whether she had the courage to press the play button and hear whatever William had recorded. Part of her wanted to throw the entire box away, to pretend she had never found it, to preserve what remained of her illusions about the man she had loved and trusted for over 3 decades. But she knew that ignorance was no longer an option, that she had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Whatever was on that tape, whatever those newspaper clippings meant, whatever other secrets were hidden in the boxes and files that surrounded her, she needed to know the truth. Not just for her own peace of mind, but for the families who had lost children, for the community that had trusted William with their most precious possessions, for the memory of little Eli Sanderson, who had never gotten the chance to grow up. She carried the tape recorder downstairs to William's study, the room where he had spent countless hours preparing sermons and counseling parishioners and handling the administrative details of church life. The study had always been his private domain, a space that she entered only to clean or to deliver messages that couldn't wait. Now it felt like a crime scene waiting to be processed, every book and paper and personal item a potential piece of evidence in a puzzle that she was only beginning to understand. Bernice sat in William's leather desk chair, the same chair where he had written hundreds of sermons about love and forgiveness and the protection of the innocent, and pressed the play button on the tape recorder. For a moment, there was only the soft hiss of blank tape, and she began to hope that maybe the cassette was empty, that this would turn out to be another false alarm in what was becoming a nightmare of doubt and suspicion. But then William's voice filled the room, younger than she remembered but unmistakably his, speaking in the measured tones he used when he was working through complex theological concepts. Except he wasn't discussing theology. He was describing children, specific children from his congregation, detailing their schedules and habits and family situations with the kind of careful observation that made Bernice's blood run cold. The tape was dated July 15, 1994, less than a week after Eli Sanderson had disappeared, and as William's voice continued, describing not just Eli but other children in terms that no pastor should ever use, Bernice began to understand that the man she had been married to for 32 years was a stranger whose true nature she was only now beginning to glimpse. But the most chilling moment came near the end of the recording, when William's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and he said something that would echo in Bernice's mind for years to come. He talked about opportunities that had been missed, about being more careful in the future, about the need to expand his reach beyond the confines of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. And then, in a tone of voice that suggested he was making a solemn vow, he said that Eli Sanderson would not be the last. The silence that followed William's recorded voice was deafening, more profound than any quiet Bernice had ever experienced. She sat motionless in his chair for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, her mind struggling to process words that seemed to have been spoken in a foreign language, despite being delivered in her husband's familiar Alabama drawl. The tape recorder continued to hiss softly, the mechanical sound providing a soundtrack to the complete destruction of everything she had believed about her life. When she finally found the strength to move, it was to reach for the wastebasket beside William's desk, her body responding to revulsion before her mind could catch up. She vomited until there was nothing left, her stomach muscles contracting painfully as wave after wave of nausea washed over her. The physical reaction was almost a relief, a concrete response to information that was too abstract and horrible to process emotionally. Her body, at least, understood what her husband's words meant, even if her mind was still trying to reject their implications. After the sickness passed, Bernice found herself crying in a way she hadn't since she was a child, huge gasping sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief or fear or anger. These weren't the tears of a widow mourning her husband's death, but of a woman discovering that her entire adult life had been built on lies, that the person she had shared her bed and her secrets and her dreams with had been someone she never really knew at all. Every moment of intimacy they had shared was now contaminated by the knowledge of what he had been capable of, what he had actually done. She must have sat there crying for over an hour, because when she finally looked up, the afternoon sun was slanting through the study windows at a different angle, casting shadows that made the familiar room look foreign and sinister. The books on William's shelves, many of them about pastoral care and child development, now seemed like evidence of a carefully constructed facade. The certificates and awards on his walls, recognition for his service to the community, and his dedication to youth ministry looked like trophies celebrating successful deception rather than genuine achievement. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else emerged in its place, something harder and more determined than grief. Bernice wiped her eyes and rewound the tape, forcing herself to listen to William's voice again, this time taking notes about specific details and dates that might be important. If her husband had been responsible for Eli Sanderson's disappearance, if he had been contemplating harming other children, then she had a responsibility that went far beyond protecting his memory or her own emotional well-being. The recording was approximately 15 minutes long, and it became clear that William had been using the tape recorder as a kind of private journal, a place where he could explore thoughts and impulses that he couldn't share with anyone else. He spoke about individual children in the congregation with a clinical detachment that was chilling in its intensity, describing their physical characteristics and behavioral patterns as if he were a scientist studying specimens rather than a pastor caring for his flock. But it was his discussion of opportunities and logistics that made Bernice's blood run cold. William talked about church events and activities that would provide access to children away from their parents' direct supervision. He mentioned specific families that were struggling financially or emotionally, situations that might make parents less likely to question a pastor's special interest in their children. He even referenced other churches in the area where he had been invited to speak or lead workshops, expanding his potential hunting ground beyond the boundaries of St. Matthew's. The final section of the recording was the most disturbing, as William's voice took on an almost meditative quality, while he described what he called the moment of understanding that had occurred during the church picnic. He never explicitly described harming Eli, never provided details that would constitute a confession in any legal sense, but the implications of his words were unmistakable. He had seen an opportunity and acted on it, and the result had been the permanent disappearance of a 7-year-old boy. Bernice played the tape 3 times before she felt confident that she had extracted all the information it contained, making careful notes about names and dates and locations that William had mentioned. But even as she documented the evidence, part of her mind was working frantically to find alternative explanations for what she was hearing. Maybe William had been writing a novel or a screenplay about a predatory pastor, exploring fictional scenarios for creative purposes. Maybe he had been studying criminal psychology as part of his theological education, trying to understand the nature of evil so he could better counsel people who had encountered it. But these rationalizations crumbled under the weight of what she knew about her husband's actual behavior and interests. William had never shown any inclination toward creative writing, had never expressed interest in criminal psychology beyond what was necessary for pastoral counseling. More importantly, the recording contained too many specific details about real people and real situations to be fictional. This wasn't a creative exercise or an academic study. This was a man documenting his own predatory thoughts and actions with the methodical precision of someone who planned to continue them. The discovery of additional tapes in William's filing cabinet confirmed Bernice's worst fears. There were 6 cassettes in total, spanning the years from 1992 to 2006, each one labeled with dates and cryptic notations that only made sense in the context of what she now understood about her husband's secret life. The early tapes contained mostly speculation and fantasy, William working through scenarios and possibilities with the careful attention of someone developing a long-term strategy. But as the years progressed, The recordings became more specific, more confident, more detailed in their descriptions of actual events and planned activities. The 1995 tape contained references to 3 other missing children cases from Alabama and Mississippi, disappearances that had been attributed to stranger abductions or family situations, but that William discussed with an intimate knowledge that suggested personal involvement. The 1998 recording detailed his growing network of contacts in churches throughout the Southeast, relationships he had cultivated with other clergy members who shared his interests and provided mutual support for activities that they couldn't pursue alone. By 2001, William was speaking about a fully operational system, a carefully organized network of trusted individuals who worked together to identify potential targets, create opportunities for access, and ensure that investigations into disappearances would be misdirected or abandoned. He referenced specific law enforcement officials who could be counted on to overlook evidence or discourage thorough investigations, community leaders who would vouch for the character of accused clergy members, and media contacts who would help shape public narratives about missing children cases. The most recent tape, dated 2006, revealed that William's activities had expanded far beyond individual predation to include what he described as recruitment and training of younger clergy members who showed potential for joining his network. He spoke with pride about mentoring programs he had established, workshops on youth ministry that he conducted at seminaries and conferences, and the careful process of identifying and grooming potential collaborators who shared his interests but lacked the experience and connections to pursue them safely. But it was in this final recording that William also revealed his growing paranoia about being discovered, his concern that law enforcement techniques were becoming more sophisticated, and that public awareness of predatory behavior among clergy was making his activities more dangerous. He spoke about the need to be more careful, to limit his personal involvement in direct actions, to focus more on coordination and planning, while allowing younger and less experienced network members to take the primary risks. The implications were staggering. Bernice realized that she wasn't just dealing with evidence of her husband's individual crimes, but with documentation of what appeared to be an organized conspiracy involving multiple perpetrators across several states. The scope of the network that William described suggested that dozens or even hundreds of children might have been victimized over the course of more than a decade, and that many of those crimes had been successfully concealed through corruption and manipulation of religious and civic institutions. As she worked through the evidence, Bernice found herself thinking about all the families she had known over the years who had experienced unexplained tragedies. Children who had run away and never been found. Teenagers who had committed self-harm in ways that seemed completely out of character. Young adults who had left the church and their communities abruptly, cutting ties with families and friends without explanation. How many of these situations might actually have been connected to William's activities and those of his collaborators? The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable, but Bernice knew that she couldn't ignore what she had discovered, or hope that it would somehow resolve itself without her involvement. Too many children had already been harmed, and if William's network was still operational after his death, more children were at risk every day that she delayed taking action. But she also understood that approaching law enforcement with accusations against a recently deceased pastor would require more evidence than a handful of audio recordings and personal possessions from a missing child. She needed to understand the full extent of William's activities, to identify other potential victims and collaborators, to gather enough documentation to convince investigators that these crimes were real and that the people responsible needed to be held accountable. It would mean delving deeper into her husband's secret life, exposing herself to information that would be even more disturbing than what she had already discovered, but the alternative was allowing a criminal network to continue operating unchallenged, allowing more families to experience the devastation that the Sandersons had endured. Bernice spent the rest of that day methodically searching William's study, looking for additional evidence that might support or expand on what she had learned from the recordings. She found financial records showing unexplained cash withdrawals and payments to individuals and organizations that weren't connected to legitimate church business. She discovered correspondence with other clergy members that used coded language to discuss special ministries and select programs that seemed designed to conceal their true nature from casual observation. Most disturbing of all, she found a detailed journal that William had kept from 1993 to 2010, written in a cipher that took her several hours to decode, but that ultimately revealed a comprehensive record of his criminal activities. The journal entries were clinical and methodical, documenting not just William's own actions, but those of his network collaborators, complete with dates, locations, victim descriptions, and operational details that would have been invaluable to law enforcement if they had known to look for them. The journal confirmed Bernice's worst fears about the scope of William's activities, while also revealing new horrors that she hadn't anticipated. In addition to direct harm to children, the network had been involved in trafficking activities that moved victims across state lines, making investigation and prosecution more complicated. They had also been systematically blackmailing community leaders who discovered evidence of their activities, using compromising information to ensure silence and cooperation rather than exposure and accountability. But perhaps most chilling was William's documentation of what he called disposal protocols, detailed procedures for ensuring that victims who might be able to identify their attackers would never have the opportunity to do so. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality of what was being described, and Bernice found herself confronting the possibility that Eli Sanderson and many other missing children hadn't simply been abducted, but had been murdered to protect the network's security. As night fell over Mobile, Bernice sat surrounded by the evidence of her husband's crimes, trying to process the magnitude of what she had uncovered. The man she had loved and trusted for over 30 years had not only been a predator himself, but had been the leader of an organization that had destroyed dozens of lives while operating under the protection of religious institutions and community trust. The scope of the betrayal was so vast that she struggled to comprehend it, let alone figure out how to respond to it appropriately. But as she sat there in William's study, surrounded by the documentation of horrors that most people couldn't imagine, Bernice made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She was going to expose everything, regardless of the cost to herself or her husband's memory. The families who had lost children deserved to know what had really happened to them. The communities that had trusted these predators deserved to understand how their institutions had been corrupted. And the children who might still be at risk deserved someone willing to fight for their protection, even if that someone was just a widow whose world had been shattered by the discovery of truths she had never wanted to learn. The first step would be identifying other potential victims and gathering enough evidence to convince law enforcement that these crimes were real and ongoing. Bernice knew that accusations against deceased clergy members would be met with skepticism, especially when those accusations came from a grieving widow who might be seen as mentally unstable or vindictive. She would need irrefutable proof, multiple sources of evidence, and probably the testimony of living witnesses who could corroborate her claims. But as she began to plan her investigation, Bernice realized that she wasn't starting from zero. William's records contained enough names and details to provide starting points for identifying other network members and potential victims. The financial records could be used to trace payments and transactions that might reveal the network's current operations, and the coded correspondence might contain information about upcoming activities that could be prevented if law enforcement could be convinced to take action quickly enough. The enormity of the task ahead was daunting, but Bernice felt a sense of purpose that she hadn't experienced since William's death. For months, she had been struggling to figure out what her life meant without him, how to build an identity that wasn't defined by being a pastor's wife. Now she understood that her real life was just beginning, that everything she had experienced before this moment had been preparation for the most important work she would ever do. But as she began organizing the evidence she had gathered, Bernice made a discovery that changed everything she thought she understood about the timeline of William's crimes. Hidden behind a false back in one of his desk drawers was a manila envelope containing photographs that had clearly been taken recently, within the past few months before his death. The images showed children from their current congregation, taken with a telephoto lens from distances that suggested surveillance rather than casual documentation. The photographs were date-stamped just 3 weeks before William's heart attack, proof that his predatory activities had continued right up until his death, and suggesting that his network was still actively operating without him. But more than that, the images included several children whose families Bernice knew personally, children who attended the church where she still worshipped, children who were still in danger from collaborators who had outlived their leader. The discovery meant that this wasn't just about exposing past crimes or seeking justice for families who had already lost their children. This was about protecting children who were in immediate danger, preventing future crimes that might already be in the planning stages. And as Bernice stared at the photographs of innocent faces that had been marked for predation by people they trusted, she realized that she was no longer just a widow seeking answers about her husband's secret life. She was the only person standing between Williams' network and their next victims. The photographs spread across Williams' desk told a story that made Bernice's hands shake as she tried to organize them chronologically. Each image had been taken with professional-grade equipment, the kind of telephoto lens that allowed the photographer to remain undetected while capturing intimate moments of children's daily lives. School pickup lines, playground activities, church youth group meetings, even some that appeared to have been taken through bedroom windows during evening hours when families thought they were safe in their private spaces. 7 children in total, ranging in age from 5 to 12, all from families that attended St. Matthew's or had recently moved to Mobile and were considering membership. Bernice recognized each face, could recite their names and their parents' occupations and their favorite Sunday school activities. The Morrison twins, whose mother had just started bringing them to church after their father deployed overseas with the military. Little Sarah Chen, whose family had relocated from California and was still adjusting to life in Alabama. The Kowalski boy, whose parents worked double shifts at the shipyard and relied on church childcare programs to bridge the gaps in their schedules. But it was the final photograph that made Bernice's breath catch in her throat. 8-year-old Marcus Williams, whose grandmother had been one of Bernice's closest friends before her death the previous year. Marcus lived with his single mother now, in a cramped apartment near the port where she worked cleaning offices at night. The boy often stayed late at church programs because his mother couldn't pick him up until after her shift ended. He was exactly the kind of vulnerable child that predators looked for, isolated and unsupervised, with a parent too overwhelmed by circumstances to notice subtle changes in behavior or unexplained absences. The date stamp on Marcus's photograph was February 18, 2013, just 4 days before William's heart attack. The image showed the boy walking alone from the church to the nearby bus stop where his mother usually collected him after evening programs. But what made the photograph particularly sinister was the notation written on the back in William's careful handwriting. Primary target, timeline accelerated, recruitment phase initiated. Bernice felt the familiar wave of nausea rising in her throat as she tried to process what those words meant. William had been planning something specific involving Marcus Williams, something that required recruitment of other network members and an accelerated timeline that suggested urgency or opportunity. If William hadn't died when he did, if his heart attack hadn't intervened, Marcus might have become another Eli Sanderson, another missing child whose disappearance would be explained away with comfortable lies while his family destroyed themselves with grief and unanswered questions. But the implications went beyond what William had been planning. The notation suggested that other network members had been informed about the plan, that recruitment was already underway, that William's death might have delayed but not cancelled whatever operation had been in development. Marcus Williams was still in danger, still being watched by people who saw him as an opportunity rather than a human being, still vulnerable to predators who had outlived their leader but retained their access to his intended victims. The realization that immediate action was necessary cut through Bernice's paralysis like a blade. This wasn't just about exposing past crimes or seeking justice for historical victims. This was about protecting a specific child who was in active danger from people who might already be positioning themselves to take advantage of William's absence. She couldn't afford to spend weeks or months building a comprehensive case, if doing so meant allowing Marcus Williams to become the network's next victim. But approaching law enforcement with her evidence presented almost insurmountable challenges. The Mobile Police Department would be reluctant to believe accusations against a recently deceased pastor without overwhelming proof, especially accusations coming from his widow, who might be seen as emotionally unstable or seeking attention. The evidence she had discovered would be dismissed as circumstantial or misinterpreted as the private fantasies of a man who never acted on his impulses. And even if investigators took her seriously, the complex nature of the network William had described would make it difficult to identify and apprehend all the collaborators before they could harm Marcus or other potential victims. Bernice spent the early morning hours of what felt like the longest night of her life trying to decode the network structure that William had documented in his journal and correspondence. The organization operated with careful compartmentalization, ensuring that individual members knew only what they needed to complete their specific assignments while protecting the identities and activities of other collaborators. But William's position as a founding member and central coordinator had given him access to information that could potentially expose the entire operation if properly interpreted and corroborated. The network included at least 15 active members spread across Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, most of them clergy members or other professionals who worked with children in educational or social service capacities. They communicated through coded messages, embedded in legitimate church newsletters and administrative documents, used cash transactions and untraceable gift cards to fund their activities, and maintained detailed intelligence files on potential targets and their families. The sophistication of their operations explained how they had managed to avoid detection for so long while victimizing children across multiple jurisdictions. But it was the network's infiltration of law enforcement and government agencies that presented the greatest challenge to exposing their crimes. William's records indicated that they had cultivated relationships with specific police officers, prosecutors, and judges, who could be counted on to discourage thorough investigations or influence the outcomes of cases that might threaten network security. They had also placed members in positions within child protective services and family courts, allowing them to access confidential information about vulnerable children while ensuring that reports of abuse would be minimized or misdirected. The corruption extended to the religious institutions that provided cover for their activities. Several bishops and denominational leaders had been compromised through blackmail or financial incentives, ensuring that clergy members accused of impropriety would be quietly transferred rather than investigated, that victims who came forward would be counseled to forgive and forget rather than pursue justice, that families who asked too many questions would be marginalized and isolated until they stopped seeking answers. As dawn broke over Mobile, Bernice found herself facing an enemy that seemed too powerful and well-connected to be defeated by a single widow with a box of evidence. But she also understood that her unique position as William's wife gave her advantages that no other potential whistleblower would possess. She had unrestricted access to his records and personal effects, intimate knowledge of his habits and associations, and the credibility that came with being seen as a grieving widow rather than a potential threat to powerful interests. More importantly, she had nothing left to lose. William's death had already destroyed her life as she had known it, and the discovery of his crimes had eliminated any possibility of rebuilding that life on its previous foundations. She could choose to remain silent and try to construct a new identity based on comfortable lies, or she could accept the role that circumstances had thrust upon her and fight to protect children who had no other defender. The decision to contact Margaret Sanderson came after hours of debate with herself about the ethics and practicality of involving Eli's mother in an investigation that might ultimately prove more devastating than the original loss. Margaret had spent 18 years believing that her son had died in a tragic accident, and learning that he had actually been murdered by someone she had trusted would add new dimensions of pain to grief that had never fully healed. But she also deserved to know the truth about what had happened to her child, and her perspective as a victim might provide insights that could help protect other families from experiencing similar losses. The phone call was the most difficult conversation Bernice had ever initiated. Margaret's voice still carried the careful control of someone who had learned to manage her pain in public settings, but underneath the polite responses, Bernice could hear the eternal hope of a mother who had never stopped believing that someday she might get answers about her child's disappearance. When Bernice explained that she had discovered evidence relating to Eli's case, Margaret's composure cracked in ways that were heartbreaking to witness even over the phone. But as Bernice carefully described what she had found, leaving out the most graphic details while conveying the essential facts about William's involvement in Eli's disappearance, Margaret's response surprised her with its strength and determination. Instead of collapsing under the weight of confirmation that her worst fears had been justified, Margaret seemed energized by finally having concrete evidence to replace the endless questions that had tormented her for nearly 2 decades. Margaret revealed that she had never fully accepted the official explanation for Eli's disappearance, that inconsistencies in witness statements and investigative procedures had always bothered her, that she had continued conducting her own informal investigation long after law enforcement had moved on to other cases. She had accumulated her own collection of evidence and theories over the years, including information about other missing children cases that shared suspicious similarities with Eli's situation. More importantly, Margaret had maintained contact with other families who had lost children under questionable circumstances, forming an informal network of parents who supported each other while continuing to seek answers about their children's fates. Some of these families had suspected church involvement in their children's disappearances, but had been discouraged from pursuing those suspicions by community pressure and institutional resistance. The possibility of combining Bernice's documentary evidence with Margaret's investigative work and the collective knowledge of other affected families offered hope for building a case strong enough to overcome the network's defenses. But it also raised the stakes considerably, expanding the scope of the investigation while potentially exposing more people to retaliation from criminal organization that had already demonstrated its willingness to silence potential threats. Margaret insisted on meeting in person to review the evidence, and they arranged to get together that afternoon at a coffee shop in downtown Mobile, where they could speak privately without attracting attention from people who might know them through church connections. Bernice spent the morning organizing copies of the most important documents and recordings, preparing to share information that would shatter another person's understanding of their world, while hoping that the collaboration might lead to justice for all the children who had been harmed. But as she prepared to leave for the meeting, Bernice discovered something that made her reconsider the safety of involving Margaret or anyone else in her investigation. Hidden in the final pages of William's journal was a detailed description of security protocols that the network employed to protect itself from exposure, including specific procedures for identifying and eliminating potential threats to their operations. The network maintained constant surveillance of families who had lost children to their activities, monitoring for signs that parents might be conducting independent investigations or asking questions that could lead to uncomfortable discoveries. They had protocols for discrediting potential whistleblowers through character assassination and manufactured scandals, for isolating families from their support systems through community manipulation, and for more direct interventions when subtle methods proved insufficient. Most chilling of all was William's documentation of what he called permanent solutions. For situations where exposure seemed inevitable, detailed procedures for staging accidents or apparent suicides that would eliminate threats while discouraging other potential investigators from pursuing similar lines of inquiry. The network had apparently used these methods successfully on multiple occasions, targeting not just potential victims, but also parents, journalists, and law enforcement officers who had gotten too close to uncovering their activities. The realization that her investigation might be putting Margaret Sanderson and other families at risk forced Bernice to reconsider her approach entirely. Simply exposing the network's crimes might not be sufficient if doing so resulted in retaliatory violence against the people she was trying to help. She needed to find a way to protect potential allies while building a case strong enough to ensure that network members couldn't escape justice through corruption or intimidation. But as she struggled with these strategic considerations, Bernice received a phone call that changed everything. She thought she understood about the timeline and urgency of her situation. The caller identified himself as Detective Ray Morrison from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, and his first words made her blood run cold. "Mrs. Carter, I'm calling about a missing child case we're investigating. We have reason to believe that your late husband may have had some connection to our victim, and we need to ask you some questions about his activities and associates." The victim, Detective Morrison explained, was 8-year-old Marcus Williams, who had failed to return home from a church youth program the night before. The same Marcus Williams whose photograph Bernice had found among her husband's surveillance materials, the child who had been marked as a primary target with an accelerated timeline for recruitment. Williams' network had moved faster than she had anticipated, and Marcus Williams was already missing. Detective Ray Morrison's voice carried the controlled urgency of a professional who understood that every minute counted when a child was missing, but underneath that measured tone, Bernice could hear something else: frustration, maybe even desperation. The sound of an investigator who had already encountered obstacles that made no sense in what should have been a straightforward missing person case. When she told him that she might have information relevant to Marcus Williams' disappearance, the relief in his response was palpable. They agreed to meet at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department within the hour, and Bernice spent the drive from Mobile to Birmingham, trying to decide how much she could safely reveal, without sounding like a grieving widow whose mental state had been compromised by loss and isolation. The evidence she had discovered was so extensive and so damning that presenting it all at once would likely overwhelm Detective Morrison's capacity to believe what she was telling him. But Marcus Williams was in immediate danger, and partial revelations might not provide enough information to locate him before irreparable harm was done. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Department occupied a modern building near downtown Birmingham, all glass and steel, designed to project competence and transparency in an era when public trust in law enforcement required constant reinforcement. Detective Morrison met her in the lobby, a tall man in his early 40s with graying hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested he had been working this case without sleep since Marcus disappeared. His handshake was firm but brief, and he led her immediately to a conference room where the walls were covered with photographs, maps, and timeline charts that represented the current state of their investigation. The missing child protocols had been activated within hours of Marcus's disappearance, Detective Morrison explained, but the initial response had been hampered by jurisdictional complications and what he diplomatically described as inconsistent cooperation from some of the agencies that should have been providing assistance. Marcus had last been seen leaving a church youth program in Mobile, but his trail had gone cold before crossing into Jefferson County, making it unclear where the investigation should be centered or which department should take the lead. More troubling were the institutional obstacles that had emerged as soon as Detective Morrison began asking questions about Marcus's background and the circumstances of his disappearance. The Mobile Police Department had been reluctant to share information about similar cases, claiming that privacy concerns and ongoing investigations prevented them from discussing details that might be relevant to Marcus's situation. Church officials had been similarly unhelpful, expressing sympathy for the family while declining to provide access to records or personnel that might shed light on how Marcus had been targeted. Even Marcus's mother had been difficult to interview, not because she was uncooperative, but because she had been heavily sedated by medical professionals who claimed she was too distraught to provide reliable information. Detective Morrison's attempts to question her had been blocked by social workers and victim advocates who insisted that her fragile mental state required protection from additional trauma. The pattern of obstruction was so systematic that it suggested coordination rather than coincidence, as if someone with significant influence had been working to ensure that the investigation would be misdirected or abandoned. Bernice listened to Detective Morrison's description of these obstacles with growing recognition, understanding that he was encountering the same institutional resistance that had derailed investigations into Eli Sanderson's disappearance and probably many other cases over the years. The network that William had documented was actively working to protect itself from exposure, using the same methods they had perfected over decades of successful concealment. But this time, their activities were being observed by someone who understood their tactics and had access to intelligence that could potentially counter their defensive measures. The decision to trust Detective Morrison with the full scope of what she had discovered came when he mentioned that he had been working missing children cases for over 15 years and had developed suspicions about patterns that seemed to recur across multiple jurisdictions. He had noticed that certain types of children disappeared with suspicious frequency from certain types of locations, that investigations into these disappearances often encountered similar bureaucratic obstacles, and that the few cases that were solved typically resulted in plea bargains that minimized public exposure of the details involved. Detective Morrison had even identified several specific individuals who appeared in the background of multiple investigations, people who claimed to be helping with search efforts or providing support to affected families, but who seemed more interested in gathering information about what investigators were discovering than in actually finding missing children. He had begun developing his own theories about organized predator networks operating under the protection of religious and civic institutions, but he had been unable to gather enough evidence to convince his superiors to support a comprehensive investigation. Bernice's evidence provided the missing pieces that Detective Morrison needed to transform his suspicions into a prosecutable case. The recordings of William's voice provided direct testimony from a network member about the organization's structure and activities. The financial records documented funding sources and money laundering operations that could be traced through banking systems. The correspondence revealed communication networks and operational procedures that could be monitored and intercepted. Most importantly, the surveillance photographs of Marcus Williams provided proof that the boy's disappearance was not random, but was the result of careful planning by people who had been watching him for weeks. But the evidence also revealed that the network's influence extended far enough to compromise any conventional investigation that followed normal bureaucratic channels. Detective Morrison would need to work outside established procedures, building his case through unofficial channels while protecting his sources from retaliation by people who had the power to destroy careers and lives. The investigation would require secrecy, speed, and resources that went beyond what a single detective could provide, even one working with the full support of his department. The solution came when Detective Morrison revealed that he had been unofficially collaborating with agents from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit who shared his suspicions about organized predator networks, but had been unable to develop cases that could withstand the legal challenges mounted by powerful defendants. The federal agents had been tracking financial transactions and communication patterns that suggested interstate criminal activity, but they lacked the local intelligence needed to identify specific perpetrators and victims. Bernice's evidence could provide the foundation for a federal investigation that would bypass the local corruption that had protected the network for so long. But mounting such an investigation would require careful coordination to ensure that network members didn't have advance warning that would allow them to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses. Most critically, it would require locating Marcus Williams before the people who had taken him realized that their security had been compromised. The timeline that William had documented in his notes suggested that the network typically held victims for 72 hours before moving them to secondary locations where they would be held for longer periods or disposed of permanently. Marcus had been missing for 18 hours, which meant that there was still time to locate him if investigators could identify where he was being held and coordinate a rescue operation that would also gather evidence against his captors. Detective Morrison activated an emergency response protocol that brought FBI agents to Birmingham within hours of his initial call to Washington. The federal team included specialists in organized crime, child exploitation, financial investigation, and tactical operations, all of whom had experience with complex cases involving multiple jurisdictions and politically sensitive defendants. But even with federal resources and expertise, the investigation faced challenges that made success uncertain. The network's compartmentalized structure meant that individual members might not know where Marcus was being held or who was responsible for his custody. The surveillance and counter-surveillance capabilities that William had documented suggested that the organization would be aware of any large-scale law enforcement response and would have protocols for eliminating evidence if they felt threatened. Most challenging of all was the time pressure created by Marcus's captivity, which forced investigators to take risks and make decisions without the careful planning that such operations normally required. The breakthrough came when FBI analysts combined Bernice's intelligence with financial records they had been monitoring for months as part of their ongoing investigation. The transactions that William had documented matched patterns that federal agents had identified in bank accounts linked to suspected predator networks, providing corroboration for his claims while revealing additional financial connections that he hadn't been aware of when he made his recordings. One of those connections led to a property outside Huntsville that had been purchased through a shell company linked to multiple network members, a remote facility that appeared to be used for meetings and training activities that required privacy and security. Vehicle tracking data showed that several cars registered to suspected network associates had visited the property within the past 24 hours, suggesting that it might be where Marcus was being held while his captors decided what to do with him. The tactical operation to rescue Marcus and apprehend his captors required coordination between federal agents, local law enforcement, and specialized units that could provide surveillance, communication support, and emergency medical services. The complexity of the operation was complicated by the need to maintain secrecy until the last possible moment, ensuring that network members didn't receive advance warning that would allow them to escape or eliminate evidence of their crimes. Bernice found herself in the surreal position of serving as a consultant for an FBI operation, designed to apprehend people who had been her husband's colleagues and collaborators. Her knowledge of Williams' documentation proved invaluable for understanding the network's operational procedures and security protocols, information that helped federal agents plan approaches that would minimize the risk of evidence destruction or harm to Marcus if the rescue attempt was detected before completion. But as the operation developed, Bernice also became aware of the personal risks she faced as a result of her cooperation with law enforcement. The network's security procedures included protocols for eliminating threats to their organization, and her possession of Williams' records made her a primary target for retaliation. Detective Morrison and the FBI agents provided protection for her during the immediate crisis, but they also made it clear that her safety could not be guaranteed in the long term if network members who escaped apprehension decided to take revenge against the person who had exposed their activities. The decision to proceed with the operation despite these risks was made easier by the knowledge that Marcus Williams was in immediate danger and that any delay might result in his death or disappearance to a location where he could never be found. But it was complicated by intelligence suggesting that the network had contingency plans for situations exactly like this one, procedures for eliminating victims, and evidence if their security was compromised in ways that threatened the organization's survival. As federal agents prepared to move on the Huntsville property, intercepted communications indicated that network members were already aware that something had gone wrong with their security. They were discussing the possibility that Williams' death had not been as natural as it appeared, speculating about whether his records might have survived and fallen into the wrong hands. Most ominously, they were referencing protocols for cleaning house and cutting losses that suggested they were prepared to eliminate Marcus and any other potential witnesses if they felt sufficiently threatened. The operation was launched at dawn on what would prove to be one of the most important days in the history of federal investigation into organized child exploitation. Multiple tactical teams moved simultaneously on targets across 3 states, executing search warrants and arrest orders that had been prepared in secret over the previous 48 hours. The coordination required to mount such an operation while maintaining security was unprecedented, involving hundreds of federal agents and local law enforcement officers who had been briefed only hours before the operation began. But as the tactical teams closed in on their targets, emergency communications from the Huntsville property indicated that they might already be too late. Smoke was visible from the facility where Marcus was believed to be held, suggesting that evidence was being destroyed and that the people inside were prepared to eliminate witnesses rather than allow themselves to be captured alive. The race to reach Marcus Williams before his captors could harm him had begun, and the outcome would determine not only whether one child lived or died, but whether an organization that had operated in secret for decades would finally be exposed to the justice it had evaded for so long. Detective Ray Morrison's voice carried the controlled urgency of a professional who understood that every minute counted when a child was missing, but underneath that measured tone, Bernice could hear something else. Frustration, maybe even desperation. The sound of an investigator who had already encountered obstacles that made no sense in what should have been a straightforward missing person case. When she told him that she might have information relevant to Marcus Williams' disappearance, the relief in his response was palpable. They agreed to meet at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department within the hour, and Bernice spent the drive from Mobile to Birmingham, trying to decide how much she could safely reveal, without sounding like a grieving widow whose mental state had been compromised by loss and isolation. The evidence she had discovered was so extensive and so damning that presenting it all at once would likely overwhelm Detective Morrison's capacity to believe what she was telling him. But Marcus Williams was in immediate danger, and partial revelations might not provide enough information to locate him before irreparable harm was done. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Department occupied a modern building near downtown Birmingham, all glass and steel, designed to project competence and transparency in an era when public trust in law enforcement required constant reinforcement. Detective Morrison met her in the lobby, a tall man in his early 40s with graying hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested he had been working this case without sleep since Marcus disappeared. His handshake was firm but brief, and he led her immediately to a conference room where the walls were covered with photographs, maps, and timeline charts that represented the current state of their investigation. The missing child protocols had been activated within hours of Marcus's disappearance, Detective Morrison explained, but the initial response had been hampered by jurisdictional complications and what he diplomatically described as inconsistent cooperation from some of the agencies that should have been providing assistance. Marcus had last been seen leaving a church youth program in Mobile, but his trail had gone cold before crossing into Jefferson County, making it unclear where the investigation should be centered or which department should take the lead. More troubling were the institutional obstacles that had emerged as soon as Detective Morrison began asking questions about Marcus's background and the circumstances of his disappearance. The Mobile Police Department had been reluctant to share information about similar cases, claiming that privacy concerns and ongoing investigations prevented them from discussing details that might be relevant to Marcus's situation. Church officials had been similarly unhelpful, expressing sympathy for the family while declining to provide access to records or personnel that might shed light on how Marcus had been targeted. Even Marcus's mother had been difficult to interview, not because she was uncooperative, but because she had been heavily sedated by medical professionals who claimed she was too distraught to provide reliable information. Detective Morrison's attempts to question her had been blocked by social workers and victim advocates who insisted that her fragile mental state required protection from additional trauma. The pattern of obstruction was so systematic that it suggested coordination rather than coincidence, as if someone with significant influence had been working to ensure that the investigation would be misdirected or abandoned. Bernice listened to Detective Morrison's description of these obstacles with growing recognition, understanding that he was encountering the same institutional resistance that had derailed investigations into Eli Sanderson's disappearance and probably many other cases over the years. The network that William had documented was actively working to protect itself from exposure, using the same methods they had perfected over decades of successful concealment. But this time, their activities were being observed by someone who understood their tactics and had access to intelligence that could potentially counter their defensive measures. The decision to trust Detective Morrison with the full scope of what she had discovered came when he mentioned that he had been working missing children cases for over 15 years and had developed suspicions about patterns that seemed to recur across multiple jurisdictions. He had noticed that certain types of children disappeared with suspicious frequency from certain types of locations, that investigations into these disappearances often encountered similar bureaucratic obstacles, and that the few cases that were solved typically resulted in plea bargains that minimized public exposure of the details involved. Detective Morrison had even identified several specific individuals who appeared in the background of multiple investigations, people who claimed to be helping with search efforts or providing support to affected families, but who seemed more interested in gathering information about what investigators were discovering than in actually finding missing children. He had begun developing his own theories about organized predator networks operating under the protection of religious and civic institutions, but he had been unable to gather enough evidence to convince his superiors to support a comprehensive investigation. Bernice's evidence provided the missing pieces that Detective Morrison needed to transform his suspicions into a prosecutable case. The recordings of William's voice provided direct testimony from a network member about the organization's structure and activities. The financial records documented funding sources and money laundering operations that could be traced through banking systems. The correspondence revealed communication networks and operational procedures that could be monitored and intercepted. Most importantly, the surveillance photographs of Marcus Williams provided proof that the boy's disappearance was not random, but was the result of careful planning by people who had been watching him for weeks. But the evidence also revealed that the network's influence extended far enough to compromise any conventional investigation that followed normal bureaucratic channels. Detective Morrison would need to work outside established procedures, building his case through unofficial channels while protecting his sources from retaliation by people who had the power to destroy careers and lives. The investigation would require secrecy, speed, and resources that went beyond what a single detective could provide, even one working with the full support of his department. The solution came when Detective Morrison revealed that he had been unofficially collaborating with agents from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit who shared his suspicions about organized predator networks, but had been unable to develop cases that could withstand the legal challenges mounted by powerful defendants. The federal agents had been tracking financial transactions and communication patterns that suggested interstate criminal activity, but they lacked the local intelligence needed to identify specific perpetrators and victims. Bernice's evidence could provide the foundation for a federal investigation that would bypass the local corruption that had protected the network for so long. But mounting such an investigation would require careful coordination to ensure that network members didn't have advance warning that would allow them to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses. Most critically, it would require locating Marcus Williams before the people who had taken him realized that their security had been compromised. The timeline that William had documented in his notes suggested that the network typically held victims for 72 hours before moving them to secondary locations where they would be held for longer periods or disposed of permanently. Marcus had been missing for 18 hours, which meant that there was still time to locate him if investigators could identify where he was being held and coordinate a rescue operation that would also gather evidence against his captors. Detective Morrison activated an emergency response protocol that brought FBI agents to Birmingham within hours of his initial call to Washington. The federal team included specialists in organized crime, child exploitation, financial investigation, and tactical operations, all of whom had experience with complex cases involving multiple jurisdictions and politically sensitive defendants. But even with federal resources and expertise, the investigation faced challenges that made success uncertain. The network's compartmentalized structure meant that individual members might not know where Marcus was being held or who was responsible for his custody. The surveillance and counter-surveillance capabilities that William had documented suggested that the organization would be aware of any large-scale law enforcement response and would have protocols for eliminating evidence if they felt threatened. Most challenging of all was the time pressure created by Marcus's captivity, which forced investigators to take risks and make decisions without the careful planning that such operations normally required. The breakthrough came when FBI analysts combined Bernice's intelligence with financial records they had been monitoring for months as part of their ongoing investigation. The transactions that William had documented matched patterns that federal agents had identified in bank accounts linked to suspected predator networks, providing corroboration for his claims while revealing additional financial connections that he hadn't been aware of when he made his recordings. One of those connections led to a property outside Huntsville that had been purchased through a shell company linked to multiple network members, a remote facility that appeared to be used for meetings and training activities that required privacy and security. Vehicle tracking data showed that several cars registered to suspected network associates had visited the property within the past 24 hours, suggesting that it might be where Marcus was being held while his captors decided what to do with him. The tactical operation to rescue Marcus and apprehend his captors required coordination between federal agents, local law enforcement, and specialized units that could provide surveillance, communication support, and emergency medical services. The complexity of the operation was complicated by the need to maintain secrecy until the last possible moment, ensuring that network members didn't receive advance warning that would allow them to escape or eliminate evidence of their crimes. Bernice found herself in the surreal position of serving as a consultant for an FBI operation, designed to apprehend people who had been her husband's colleagues and collaborators. Her knowledge of William's documentation proved invaluable for understanding the network's operational procedures and security protocols, information that helped federal agents plan approaches that would minimize the risk of evidence destruction or harm to Marcus if the rescue attempt was detected before completion. But as the operation developed, Bernice also became aware of the personal risks she faced as a result of her cooperation with law enforcement. The network's security procedures included protocols for eliminating threats to their organization, and her possession of Williams' records made her a primary target for retaliation. Detective Morrison and the FBI agents provided protection for her during the immediate crisis, but they also made it clear that her safety could not be guaranteed in the long term if network members who escaped apprehension decided to take revenge against the person who had exposed their activities. The decision to proceed with the operation despite these risks was made easier by the knowledge that Marcus Williams was in immediate danger and that any delay might result in his death or disappearance to a location where he could never be found. But it was complicated by intelligence suggesting that the network had contingency plans for situations exactly like this one, procedures for eliminating victims, and evidence if their security was compromised in ways that threatened the organization's survival. As federal agents prepared to move on the Huntsville property, intercepted communications indicated that network members were already aware that something had gone wrong with their security. They were discussing the possibility that Williams' death had not been as natural as it appeared, speculating about whether his records might have survived and fallen into the wrong hands. Most ominously, they were referencing protocols for cleaning house and cutting losses that suggested they were prepared to eliminate Marcus and any other potential witnesses if they felt sufficiently threatened. The operation was launched at dawn on what would prove to be one of the most important days in the history of federal investigation into organized child exploitation. Multiple tactical teams moved simultaneously on targets across 3 states, executing search warrants and arrest orders that had been prepared in secret over the previous 48 hours. The coordination required to mount such an operation while maintaining security was unprecedented, involving hundreds of federal agents and local law enforcement officers who had been briefed only hours before the operation began. But as the tactical teams closed in on their targets, emergency communications from the Huntsville property indicated that they might already be too late. Smoke was visible from the facility where Marcus was believed to be held, suggesting that evidence was being destroyed and that the people inside were prepared to eliminate witnesses rather than allow themselves to be captured alive. The race to reach Marcus Williams before his captors could harm him had begun, and the outcome would determine not only whether one child lived or died, but whether an organization that had operated in secret for decades would finally be exposed to the justice it had evaded for so long. The secure briefing room in the FBI's Birmingham field office had been transformed into a war room that looked like something from a political thriller, with multiple screens displaying photographs, organizational charts, and geographic maps that illustrated connections spanning continents. Bernice sat at a conference table surrounded by federal agents, international law enforcement liaisons, and prosecutors who were struggling to comprehend the scope of what her discovery had unleashed. The investigation that had begun with a wooden crucifix hidden in an attic had expanded into what intelligence analysts were calling one of the largest and most sophisticated criminal enterprises ever documented. Special Agent Chen stood at the front of the room, using a laser pointer to highlight connections between the network that William Carter had helped establish and similar organizations operating in 17 other countries. The international scope was staggering, involving coordination between cells that operated independently while sharing resources, intelligence, and victims through a structure that had been carefully designed to survive the exposure or destruction of any individual component. What had started as a local investigation into missing children in Alabama had revealed a global trafficking operation that generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually while victimizing thousands of children across multiple continents. The evidence recovered from the Huntsville facility had provided encryption keys and communication protocols that allowed intelligence agencies to monitor conversations between network members who believed their communications were secure. What they discovered was an organization that operated with the efficiency of a multinational corporation and the ruthlessness of a military operation, complete with research and development divisions that studied new methods for identifying and accessing victims, logistics operations that could move people and resources across international borders without detection, and security departments that eliminated threats with professional precision. But it was the identity of some of the network's clients and protectors that made the investigation politically complex in ways that threatened to overwhelm the resources and authority of traditional law enforcement agencies. Intercepted communications revealed that the organization provided services to individuals whose prosecution would require cooperation from governments that might be reluctant to pursue cases against their own officials, celebrities, or business leaders. The network had apparently been collecting compromising information about its clients for years, creating a blackmail archive that provided protection against law enforcement action while generating additional revenue streams. The revelations about client identities explained why the network had been able to operate with such impunity for so long, and why William's death had not significantly disrupted their activities. The organization wasn't just protected by corruption within law enforcement agencies, but by political pressure from individuals whose careers and reputations would be destroyed if their association with child exploitation networks became public knowledge. Prosecuting the network effectively would require confronting powerful interests that had the resources and motivation to prevent such cases from reaching trial. Bernice found herself in the surreal position of learning that her husband had been a founding member of an organization that operated safe houses in major cities around the world, maintained private aircraft for transporting victims and clients, and employed sophisticated technology for surveillance and counter-surveillance operations. The scale of resources available to the network dwarfed anything she had imagined when she first discovered Eli Sanderson's crucifix, and the level of planning and coordination required to maintain such operations suggested that William had been far more intelligent and dangerous than she had ever realized. The international investigation had also revealed disturbing information about how new network members were recruited and trained, processes that explained how the organization had been able to expand its operations while maintaining security. Potential recruits were identified through careful psychological profiling, often beginning with individuals who showed signs of predatory interests but lacked the experience or connections to pursue them safely. These candidates were gradually introduced to network activities through what appeared to be legitimate, professional development opportunities, with their commitment and reliability tested through increasingly serious criminal activities before they were granted access to the organization's most sensitive operations. William's role in this recruitment process had been particularly significant, as his position as a respected religious leader provided credibility that helped the network identify and access potential members within church hierarchies throughout the southeastern United States. His workshops on youth ministry had apparently been used as recruitment tools, allowing him to evaluate participants for signs that they might be suitable candidates for network membership while maintaining the appearance of providing legitimate professional education. The discovery that William had been actively recruiting other predators throughout his career added new dimensions of horror to revelations about his activities, but it also provided opportunities for investigators to identify additional network members who might not have been discovered through other means. Seminary records, conference attendance lists, and continuing education programs that William had been involved with provided starting points for background investigations that were revealing troubling patterns among clergy members who had participated in his training programs. But as the investigation expanded to include these newly identified suspects, it became clear that the network's defensive capabilities were more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated. Several potential targets had disappeared before arrest warrants could be executed, apparently warned by sources within law enforcement agencies who remained loyal to the organization. Evidence had been destroyed or relocated beyond the reach of investigators, and financial assets had been transferred to accounts in countries that did not cooperate with international law enforcement efforts. Most concerning was intelligence indicating that the network was implementing what it called a scorched earth protocol, systematically eliminating evidence and witnesses that could be used to prosecute remaining members or identify additional victims. The protocol included procedures for staging accidents and apparent suicides that would remove threats while discouraging other potential witnesses from cooperating with investigators. Several people who had been identified as potential witnesses had died under suspicious circumstances in the weeks following the Huntsville raid, deaths that appeared unrelated but that followed patterns documented in William's notes about the network's security procedures. The realization that her cooperation with federal investigators had potentially triggered a wave of retaliatory violence against innocent people created moral burdens that Bernice struggled to process. Every new report of a suspicious death or disappearance raised questions about whether she should have remained silent about William's crimes, allowing the network to continue operating rather than provoking responses that might ultimately result in more harm than the original crimes would have caused. But federal prosecutors argued that the network's defensive reactions actually validated the importance of the investigation and demonstrated why such organizations needed to be dismantled regardless of the short-term costs involved. The fact that senior network members were willing to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence on such a massive scale proved that they understood the magnitude of their crimes and feared the consequences of full exposure. Abandoning the investigation would signal to other criminal organizations that they could engage in similar activities without facing serious accountability as long as they were prepared to respond to threats with sufficient violence. The legal challenges involved in prosecuting network members were complicated by jurisdictional issues that required coordination between multiple countries with different legal systems and varying levels of commitment to pursuing child exploitation cases. Extradition requests faced political obstacles in countries where network members had cultivated relationships with government officials, and evidence-sharing agreements were hampered by diplomatic concerns that went beyond the scope of individual criminal cases. The organization had apparently studied these legal complexities and structured their operations to exploit gaps in international law enforcement cooperation. More frustrating was the discovery that many of the network's most serious crimes had been committed in ways that made prosecution difficult, even when evidence was available. The organization had employed sophisticated legal advice to structure their activities so that individual participants could claim ignorance of broader criminal conspiracies while acknowledging only minor violations that would result in minimal sentences. They had also developed methods for destroying or contaminating evidence that made it difficult to prove specific allegations beyond reasonable doubt, even when investigators were convinced that serious crimes had occurred. The complexity of the legal challenges facing prosecutors created pressure to focus resources on cases that were most likely to result in successful convictions, often involving lower-level network members whose prosecution would have minimal impact on the organization's ability to continue operating. Senior figures who had been responsible for coordinating the network's activities were often protected by legal strategies that made them difficult to prosecute, despite overwhelming evidence of their involvement in criminal conspiracies. Bernice's role in the investigation evolved from that of a witness to something approaching a consulting detective, as her knowledge of Williams' documentation and network procedures proved invaluable for understanding evidence that investigators were recovering from multiple sources. But this expanded involvement also increased her exposure to retaliation from network members who remained at large and had both the motivation and resources to eliminate threats to their organization's security. The protection arrangements that federal agents had implemented for her safety were comprehensive but also isolating, requiring her to live under essentially house arrest conditions while investigators worked to identify and apprehend the people who posed the greatest threats to her well-being. The restrictions on her movements and communications were necessary for her protection, but also prevented her from maintaining normal relationships with family and friends who had no understanding of why she had suddenly become unavailable. The psychological toll of living under constant threat while processing ongoing revelations about her husband's crimes was almost overwhelming, but Bernice found strength in the knowledge that her actions had already resulted in the rescue of Marcus Williams and the identification of hundreds of other victims who had never received justice for the crimes committed against them. The investigation had also prevented untold future crimes by disrupting the network's operations and forcing remaining members to focus on survival rather than expansion of their activities. But the most significant development came when international intelligence agencies provided evidence that Williams' network was connected to trafficking operations that supplied victims to some of the most powerful and influential people in the world. The client list that investigators were assembling included government officials, entertainment industry figures, business leaders, and religious authorities from multiple countries, creating political complications that threatened to overwhelm the resources and authority of traditional law enforcement agencies. The scope of the conspiracy suggested that successful prosecution would require unprecedented levels of international cooperation and political will, resources that might not be available even for cases involving the exploitation of children. The network had apparently been designed from the beginning to operate beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement by ensuring that its exposure would threaten interests powerful enough to prevent serious investigations from proceeding to completion. Intelligence reports indicated that senior network members who had escaped the initial arrests were working to rebuild their operations using lessons learned from the exposure of Williams' cell. They were implementing enhanced security measures, recruiting new members from different professional backgrounds, and developing alternative methods for accessing victims that would be less vulnerable to the types of investigation that had led to their recent losses. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting that the network was accelerating its activities in response to the law enforcement pressure, implementing plans that had been held in reserve for emergency situations. These plans apparently included the systematic exploitation of victims who had been held in reserve for years, the elimination of evidence and witnesses that could not be moved to secure locations, and the activation of sleeper cells that had been established in new geographic areas as insurance against the loss of existing operations. The realization that the investigation was potentially causing more immediate harm than it was preventing created ethical dilemmas that no law enforcement agency was equipped to resolve. The choice between allowing an ongoing criminal conspiracy to continue operating or taking actions that might trigger responses resulting in greater immediate harm to innocent people represented the kind of moral complexity that most investigators never faced in their entire careers. As federal agents briefed Bernice on the latest intelligence and its implications for the investigation's direction, she realized that the simple desire for justice that had motivated her initial decision to expose Williams' crimes had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. The network she had helped expose was apparently just one component of a global criminal enterprise whose reach and influence extended into institutions and power structures that she had never imagined could be corrupted. But perhaps most troubling was the growing evidence that the investigation itself was being monitored and influenced by forces that had not yet been identified or understood. Communication intercepts suggested that someone with access to classified law enforcement information was providing regular updates to network members about investigative progress and planned operations. The source of these leaks remained unknown despite extensive internal security reviews, suggesting that the network's influence within government agencies was even more extensive than intelligence analysts had realized. The possibility that her cooperation with federal investigators was being reported to the same people she was trying to help prosecute created security concerns that went beyond personal safety to questions about whether the entire investigation could be compromised by hostile intelligence from within the law enforcement community itself. The network had apparently spent decades cultivating sources within agencies that were now trying to investigate their activities, creating a situation where every strategic decision risked exposure to the very people it was designed to apprehend. As Bernice left the briefing room and returned to the safe house where federal agents were protecting her from assassination attempts that intelligence indicated were already being planned, she understood that her decision to expose Williams' crimes had set in motion events that could not be controlled or predicted. The investigation had taken on a momentum of its own, driven by political and institutional forces that were far larger than any individual participant's ability to influence or direct. The question was no longer whether justice could be achieved for the victims of her husband's network, but whether the investigation itself would survive the defensive reactions of an enemy whose power and reach were only beginning to be understood.